welcome to NDTV Profit. Now, the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey was finally published by the government after a long-drawn delay over the weekend. Let's have a look at some of the key highlights from the survey. Household spending more than doubled over the course of the past decade, while average monthly per capita consumption in rural areas rose to 3,773 rupees. The figure was at 6,459 rupees for urban areas. Now, this was at current prices, and the survey was conducted between August 2022 and July 2023. There's rising convergence between urban as well as rural household expenditure trends, but there's also rising inequality, the survey showed. The share of food also fell in both rural as well as urban areas, while the share of discretionary spending rose. To discuss this and more, we're joined by Teresa John and Garima Kapoor, Chief Economist at Elara Capital. Teresa John is at Nirmal Bang Institutional Equities. Thank you so very much, both of you, for taking time out for us today.
Thank you, Pallavi.
So, Garima, I'll start with you. One of the key questions which most of us appear to have had post having a look at the survey findings was what explains the rural economy's performance. So, you know, over the past year, we've of course been closely tracking the rural economy, and most high-frequency indicators did seem to indicate that the rural economy was in the midst of a slowdown. However, the survey appears to indicate that rural growth, in fact, on an adjusted basis, was faster than even urban growth in terms of consumption expenditure. So, what are you making out of the rural space at this point, and what do you think explains the survey findings?
Thank you. Thank you for having me over. So two ways to understand and interpret the data relating to rural. One, of course, is that the rate of growth of rural outspacing urban is not a phenomena that happened only in this particular reference period. It was there even in the past. Number two, this is nominal growth. So it is quite possible on an adjusted basis, there would have been dip in savings because we know there was an impact of COVID. The second thing we need to also observe is that over the last 3 years, especially post-COVID digitalization boom, has also been democratization of lending when lending has reached at the grassroots, which also has been propelling some part of consumption in the periphery of tier 3, tier 4 towns that probably also do cover some part of rural India. And the third explanation which I have is basis my recent rural trip into hinterlands of Uttar Pradesh, which indicates the way we understand rural slowdown probably is only partly explained by the current data sets that are available to us. For example, FMCG volumes or two-wheeler sales or even Manrega data. While there is a slowdown, no doubt, in terms of income impact on core agriculture sector, people's preferences have shifted very significantly. You do find instances where people are willing to downtrend and downgrade consumption and eat, let's say, relatively cheaper regional options, but are willing to put that additional 11 rupees or additional 21 rupees into online gaming or online gambling or cricket betting. Now, all these aspects of rural India in terms of aspirations are not getting captured in the current dynamics of data sets that we have. And that partly explains as to why the data set that was released yesterday in terms of NSSO's consumption survey partly contradicts or probably disputes the broadly understood view that rural economy probably might be slowing in India over the last 2 to 3 years, especially post-COVID.
Okay, Teresa, what are you making of this? Also, the fact that along with some of the trends that Garima too discussed, the share of food in rural areas too is now below 50%. So, how are you reading the rural picture at this point?
Yeah, so obviously there is some amount of convergence that is happening between urban and rural in consumption trends, and that is only to be expected as the country develops. But as Garima was also saying, this you need to. I mean, this is nominal expenditure growth, so you need to take into account that you have periods of high inflation between 2011, 12, and FY23. At least the first part of this decade, 11 years, was a period of high inflation. So you need to take into account that, and also the rural slowdown that we are talking about is largely a post-COVID phenomenon. So I would say it started somewhere in end of 2021, and now it's gone all the way till we are in 2024. So it's maybe a 3-year phenomenon. So if you look at it from a decadal perspective, rural incomes have probably more than doubled. That's what even we are hearing from our channel checks. The rural slowdown that we are seeing now is mainly because over the last 2 to 3 years, we've had a situation where your income growth in rural areas and even in urban areas at the bottom of the pyramid has not actually kept up with inflation. So that's why you're seeing a slowdown in rural consumption. And more so this year, if you look at the kharif production itself is down, and that's why you're seeing the impact on the core agricultural sector. But broadly, if you look at it from a longer term trend perspective, you are seeing increasing convergence between rural and urban areas, helped by infrastructure development, increasing labor participation, particularly of women in the rural areas. So you are seeing clearly improving trends and converging trends between urban and rural.
Okay, got it. And would it be fair to say that social welfare programs have clearly gone a long way in benefiting parts of the rural economy, especially maybe the lower 5–10% maybe? Garima?
If you break up this between urban and rural, clearly up to fractile groups of 40% in rural India and up to 30% in urban India, we found the impact to be significant, especially of social welfare programs. Now, when we consider social welfare programs, we must take into account the fact that government has not accounted for the freebies or the social welfare programs that are associated with healthcare and education, because calculating the imputed value of the same is difficult. So we're largely looking at here the impact of food and impact of durables, as well as impact in terms of other items in search of drinking tap water, etc., that might be playing into the entire rural ecosystem. But yes, on a broad macro basis, in terms of if you take the average, the impact might look very minimal because impact starts to degrade or rather become negative as you move towards higher fractile consumption groups. But at a very low fractile group, up to 40% in rural, as I mentioned, and 30% in urban, the impact was found to be significantly substantial.
Okay. Teresa, I do want to ask you about education. So both rural as well as urban saw the share that's spent on education decline. Is that concerning? Also, what do you think explains that?
Yeah, so we have actually seen a trend where, when compared to other consumption categories, where mostly we have seen an increase in consumption, except for food and in that mainly cereals, where there's been a substantial decline. The decline in spending on education, both urban and rural areas, seems a little bit perplexing to me. So it was actually at a high in the 2009-10 period, and then in 2011-12 it moderated, and 2022 to 23 it is moderated further. It may be that some, because as Garima was also saying, the imputed value of education of that is provided by the government is not really factored in, even in the there are two sets of data in this, even in the data set that includes the imputed value. So it's probably that at the margin the government provision of education has improved, and that's why the spending on education could have come down mainly in urban areas, but to some extent even in rural areas. But otherwise, in general, as the country develops, and particularly in a country like India, where people do have a preference for private sector education, you should actually see the spending on education go up, even if the government is increasingly contributing and providing better quality of education. So I think this is something that needs to be monitored very closely, because from a human development perspective, spending on education and health is very important for the development of the economy.
Right, absolutely. And Garima, just taking a step back, while we've looked at a couple of maybe paradoxes or anomalies, with rural consumption expenditure growth outstripping urban, and education that we've just spoken about, broadly, the key takeaways do appear to be positive, right? Increasing convergence between urban and rural, as well as on most aspects, the data seems to be putting across a fairly encouraging picture. Would that sort of be the right way to look at it?
Yes, I would agree with that. In terms of conversions, I would have loved the conversions was even more broad-based because the conversion seems to be more prominent in higher fractile groups rather than in mid or lower. In fact, mid to higher is what we can say. Low fractile groups, indicating probably those with a lower MPCE, the conversion seems to be much less than what one would have desired in an economy like India. Broadly, three positive trends that I'll take away from the data that was released over the weekend. One is, of course, the spending on conveyance has significantly shot up both urban and rural. That explains the positive impact of construction of roads, rising opportunities outside the ecosystem where you're working, and of course, greater importance of transportation and ecosystem of logistics. Number two, health and hygiene seems to have taken precedence with health spending on healthcare rising, as well as spending on items such as fruits, dry fruits increasing. So again, somewhere a conscious shift away from certain kinds of spending towards those which are more health conscious. And third one, of course, is not a very healthy trend, but a good trend for companies which are increasing the distribution presence in rural India is packaged processed food and beverages have seen a most significant increase across all classes, both in urban and rural, and particularly in rural, it ends up being one of the components which has a significantly high wage than every other component. That clearly tells you the prospect across process and packaged food industry remain really bright in India here on.
Well, whether or not that's a particularly positive trend, we're not sure about, but it's an interesting one for sure. Teresa, I'd like to ask you, what are the implications of the survey? We've been waiting for quite some time for the findings of the survey and for the survey to be published. Now that that's done, even though we don't have the complete report as yet, what are the changes we can expect going forward? So, to begin with, what does this mean for CPI inflation?
Yeah, so from a CPI perspective, I think there might be one more round of survey that is done before the actual CPI weightages are decided. But broadly, just drawing from the trends of this report, it seems like clearly the share of cereals in the food basket will come down from currently around 9 to 10%. It may even half in the next round. The next CPI revision round. Similarly, the share of food will come down, like we're seeing the share of cereals coming down, and the share of core in inflation will go up both for for rural and urban areas. From a broader perspective, just going beyond the CPI, I think increasingly we will not be looking at rural and urban as two groups, but we probably the key differentiating factor will be income groups. So if we look at the difference between in the lower fractile classes, the difference between urban and rural, it's only around 50% or less than 50%. But if you go up to the higher fractile classes, the income disparity is much higher. So I think it will probably be incomes that will not geographies that will define consumption patterns going forward.
Okay, that's an interesting takeaway actually. But Garima, on a related note, like you've also touched upon the inequalities that the data appeared to highlight, as did Teresa. From, considering we've always had a paucity of data when it comes to, say, determining the poverty line, for instance, in the Indian economy at this point, what does this data sort of indicate?
Broad perspective, in absence of very reliable indicators on poverty, clearly the reducing of the gap between urban and rural and the conversions, at least at the higher category of fractile groups, is positive. Of course, we would want it to be more between in the middle and the low fractile groups. So it clearly indicates that poverty measured on consumption basis at a broad and aggregate level is certainly coming down. Second, it also indicates that government welfare spendings have had a very positive impact in reducing poverty and ensuring that the consumption basket is sustained even in the face of very high inflation. And it also should actually signal a strong directive for government to continue certain or some of these policy programs, probably make them more progressive in nature than what they are presently. And third, I think once the final round of survey comes out, which will actually capture the scenarios when inflation has been somewhat on a moderate moderating trend rather than the current scenario where we have seen 2-3 years of impact of very high inflation, both food and non-food, I think the picture would become even more clearer on inflation adjusted basis, where I think the conversions would look even more sensible and appealing than what it looks right now in the current set of database or the current round of collection of data.
Okay, all right. And Garima, I'd like to come back to you for a follow-up on what are we going to make of the CPI rebasing on the basis of some of this data that's already come in, while Teresa said that there'll be the need for the government to conduct one more round of this survey before it can rebase the CPI basket. I do want to ask you, even within food, we have seen a few interesting trends come up, right? Like cereal did see a stark decline in share, as did a whole bunch of items in the food basket. So within the food basket also, we can expect change in weightage, right?
That's right. So within the food basket, what you've seen is a shift from pulses as a source of protein to more milk, eggs, meat. So you will actually see that proportion or share come up there. Second, you've seen a lower share or declining share of veggies, but the share of fruits increasing. So that share or shift also is required. And more importantly, the cereal basket, which has disproportionately higher weight right now, if you can consider the current weightage in terms of consumption basket and vis-a-vis CPI, it seems to be significantly higher weighted, at least the 400 to 450 basis point. So the weightage of cereals has to come down significantly. And if I look at how food inflation has behaved in India over the last 12 years, particularly the volatile components within the food, largely it has been milk, vegetables, and to some extent cereals, which have been persistently driving food inflation. So, in effect, the declining weightage of veggies in the perishables category and cereals should actually bode well for reducing the volatility that one has seen in these two components. Because remember, these two components have been significantly impacted because of erratic monsoons and climate related disruptions. So, going forward, as the weight reduces, at least within the food basket, the rejig that we are doing should also augur well for food inflation trajectory here on, although it may not make a significant impact on headline as a whole. Within food categories, some of these drivers could have an assuaging impact on the food inflation trajectory.
Right. Teresa, coming back to you, I do want to ask you about the rise in share of durables as well. But that doesn't seem to be a particularly surprising trend. One would have expected a rise in durables. But what do you think is playing out behind that?
So the share, I think the key trend that we take away from that is there's not much difference in spending on durables. When you look at rural and urban, it's broadly the same. Rural is around 6.9% as a percentage of total consumption expenditure. In urban, it's around 7.1%. Which probably suggests that India, I mean, it's always been an low penetration story, but probably the penetration is picking up. And I think one of the reasons that why consumer durable penetration could pick up even further, and probably the share in total consumption expenditure may rise even from here, is that you're seeing increasing penetration of credit, particularly credit purchase consumer durables, whether it's two-wheelers or even household consumer durables. So probably, I think that is a trend that will sustain, and we might see the share in total expenditure increasing further in both urban and rural areas.
Okay, one last question for you, Garima, before we can close the discussion for now. The data also appears to show the aspirational value, or the rising aspirational value of both urban as well as rural Indians, right? Also from a policy perspective. So for instance, we're a short while away from the government presenting a full budget once the general elections are, of course, behind us. From a policy perspective, you did touch upon the need for continuing social security schemes, but what else were your takeaways?
The biggest takeaway, I think, of the data, of course, was convenience and aspirations are showing up irrespective whether or not they're backed by income. And that was also has been our prognosis based as a recent rural study, where individuals are willing to make conscious choices of what category of food or commodity do they want to use as cheaper regional alternative, and what category they want to uptrend and use more aspirations. The aspirations are probably also seen in greater penetration of, let's say, durable goods, in greater penetration of internet stroke entertainment, and also in certain kind of commodities where value added items in India are doing better rather than mass consumption items. Now this puts a very perplexing picture for a policymaker who has to decide whether or not rural economy needs a support. And hence I would believe that a broad level support in terms of hiking, for example, PM Kisan amount for almost all farmers, irrespective of their income category, would not be the right approach. It would rather the right approach rather would be to hike any kind of entitlements or allowances or freebies or transfer schemes, especially which are targeted at lower end basket, because there we've seen the inequality impact continues to persist even more severely than what we've seen in mid to large income category. So I would say much better targeting in terms of income category wise is probably my biggest takeaway of the current round of survey.
Great. And with that, we're completely out of time. But thank you so very much, Teresa and Garima, for taking time out for us today. Stay tuned to NDTV Profit for more.